understand the concept and the source of the concept of the paramount chieftaincy. Paramount, of course, means above all else. So if you have a paramount chief, then a paramount chief is the chief among other chiefs, the top dog, if you will. We used to call it back in the 1960s the HNIC.
That's right.
So the paramount chief has its roots in our African cultural history and heritage, whereby you would have any number of villages that all were a part of the same vastly extended family of people or one ethnic or cultural group. Each one of these villages would have its own chief, but all of these villages put together would constitute perhaps a semi-nation, depending upon how large the grouping was. And when they come together, among those chiefs of individual villages, there would be selected or elected a paramount chief. That person might be one of the village chiefs, and it might be a totally separate individual who is not necessarily chief of any individual village, but is chief over the chiefs of all of the villages that belong to that particular clan. So the idea of there being a number of individual chiefs, each with his responsibility at a local level, or limited responsibility, but there would always be the idea of a paramount chief, a chief over the chiefs, that these individual chiefs would account to, and that paramount chief was usually also the head person of a council of chiefs. So you would perhaps have a council made up of all of these individual village chiefs, and then one of them would be selected as the paramount chief, corresponding loosely to what in America we know as the chairman of the board kind of a situation. So there's always been this concept of a paramount chief in our African traditions. And like so many other of our African traditions that we brought with us to this country and to this hemisphere, we also brought the concept of a paramount chief. So at any given epoch in Black history in America, you could identify who the leading spokespersons were amongst Black people, and in some instances, who the leaders of Black people were. Each of them either being leaders and or spokespersons for some specific subset within the Black community, or within the Black race, as the case may be. But there would always be one whose eminence, shall we say, whose prominence superseded all the rest, who was the biggest of the chiefs and the spokespersons, so to speak. One good illustration that you can certainly relate to, and hopefully most of your listeners could relate to this as well, is that at the time that the great Frederick Douglass was the paramount chief, the number one spokesperson for Black people in America, there were any number of other similarly accomplished and great people, including people who could speak very well, and some maybe as well as Frederick Douglass did. Not the least amongst these was, of course, was the great Martin R. Delaney, who not only was a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, but at one time was Frederick Douglass's partner in the North Star newspaper that they used to publish together at one time before they split and went their separate ways. So Frederick Douglass was the paramount chief at that time over all of the other people that we know historically as having been his contemporaries. In other words, lived and operated at the same time that he was on the scene. Now, if we fast forward that to more contemporary times, that most people who will be in a position to see and hear this tape will be more familiar with, I would give a brief history or a synopsis of the history of the paramount chieftaincy amongst Black people in America, starting with, in the late 40s and early 50s, Mr. Roy Wilkins, who at that time was the executive secretary of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. During that period, because of the NAACP's efforts and success with trying to eradicate legal underpinnings for discrimination and racism and bigotry, Mr. Wilkins became, for all intents and purposes, the paramount chief. Now, there were other black leaders at the time. A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the brother that founded, James Farmer, who founded the Congress of Racial Equality, Whitney Young, who at that time was the head of the National Urban League. All of these folks were around, including the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was around. But the paramount chief, and I should say this, that the paramount chief is that person, that black leader or spokesperson, who is generally considered to be the main or the most major leader or spokesperson of and for black people. The one who the media, for example, will always go to get the official word on what thus saith the black community. So if they want to know, or they want to go to someone who they feel has credibility in terms of speaking on behalf of or about or to the black community and its issues and concerns, this person, whoever that person is that they run to, that would be the person who, for all intents and purposes, is the paramount chief. It has nothing to do with who thinks that person ought to be that or who thinks that person is that. If, in fact, the person functions that way, that's who and what it is. Like they say, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, chances are it's a duck. So if, in fact, people defer to this individual as though he or she was the number one representative and most credible source of information about black people, that makes that person the paramount chief. So if we start with, in contemporary times, Roy Wilkins as head of the NAACP, the executive secretary, during the heyday of that organization, during the height of their popularity and their greatest successes, then I think few people would disagree that Roy Wilkins was probably fairly to be considered to have been the paramount chief of chiefs. Then we had a phenomenon that took place called the Montgomery bus boycott. And the ministers, the pastors in Montgomery, Alabama, I believe the organization was called the Montgomery Improvement Association, selected this young 26-year-old but brilliant young man who had recently come to Montgomery to accept the pastorship of a Baptist church there, selected him to be the figurative leader of a protest movement that they had organized and intended to launch. A lot of people think that Martin Luther King launched the Montgomery bus boycott. He did not. He was recruited by the people. Pastor Johns was the main or the prime mover behind that, but he was recruited by the organization of pastors in Montgomery to be this leader because they liked his charisma, his oratorical skills, and the fact that he was young and fresh. And I think personally that it was also they pushed somebody else out there to get in the dangerous position of leading this thing, which no one really knew what the outcome would be, because it was dangerous in those days to oppose the status quo and the balance of power between white people and black people. They did literally used to tar and feather black folks, lynch us and float us down rivers, and they find bodies in swamps and all sorts of things because they simply protested against injustice and racial discrimination and bigotry. So by pushing this young guy out there who they thought maybe didn't know any better than to accept it, he got out there. The rest is history, of course. As a result of the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, at least its success to the extent that some agreed that it was a success. Some of us questioned that, and I won't get into that today. That's a story for another